in China. But I have to say though, that this whole process of how they do the vote count is very, sort of manual, low tech, but it's very efficient. They would know the results within about 2 hours. And the way that, you can do this is that each precinct basically has only about 1,000 voters. And so they do this count one by one, but then they have people stationed at these voting centers, and that's how come the TV stations were able to get the election so much sooner than the Central Election Commission. And you also had people, those who are China people, and remember the name Paris Zhang, who has written books on Chinese politics. He's now back in Taiwan in politics there, and he was running around the election commission, way before the night was early in the night, saying, oh yes, he knew for sure that the DPP had won because they had people stationed at all these polling places. Now, how was the vote actually done? And now, given what happened in the U.S. and Florida a few years ago, this is a very sort of interesting topic. And here, I mean, in the sense of, is this a fair election? Was this sort of transparent and such? Well, this is the way it worked. People, the citizens that were assigned to vote at each particular polling place presented their IDs, they got their ballots, then they marked their ballots, and they marked it, they went into these little booths with a curtain, they marked their ballots, and then they went and put it in the individual boxes. Now, I mentioned these 2 boxes because this is something that's very important, because you have to put the ballot in the right box. Because if you put it in the wrong box, one box was for the referendum, the other box was for the actual, for the presidential election. If you put them in the wrong box, they weren't counted. And I'll tell you in a minute why this was so important. Now, the actual voting is done by paper ballot. And on the ballot, they have a picture of each candidate, and then they have a box above. We don't have a picture of the ballot. No, we're going to leave it. So we've got a ballot with 2 pictures, and then a place above each ballot. Now, the way that you vote, it's that in the U.S., we often mark an X next to the person or whatever choice we want. But in Taiwan, and actually in the mainland as well, for elections there, you mark a 0. And then the way this works is, the ballot boxes are opened and the votes are taken out, and each one is actually read aloud. So you've got one person reading, you've got a panel here who is actually observing to make sure that it's fair and correct. You've got a person standing next to a blackboard. He's got a sheet of paper, and he's marking down strokes for each ballot that's counted, and they use the character jump, for the 5 strokes. And so instead of making 5 hash marks, they use that character, and then they can quickly tabulate the results. Okay, so that's very simple. And actually, this is exactly the way that it's done in China's villages. But one of the interesting things is that then the question becomes, were there problems in the vote count? And there were charges that there were irregularities. Well, in the vote count that we observed, we went to 2 polling places, and the vote counts that we observed, we could see that in the first place we went, they were still counting the presidential ballots. And there, it seemed to be very orderly process. There was a woman, she took out each ballot, she sort of showed the ballot to everyone, and then she read out the vote, and then the person standing next to the blackboard, on the paper, marked down the vote for the right side. So there was, as far as I could tell, that was pretty clear. The second one, however, the second place we went was more confused. I mean, there was more confusion in the sense that they had 2 people reading at the same time. For the second election, they were calling out the votes for the referendum. And on that, you had 2 people reading the same time. So, you could imagine where there might be some confusion and the wrong, vote would be marked on the side. So, there's that. But so, there is that. But overall, it's that part of it was not too problematic. What is very interesting and what's worth mentioning, and I know my time is running out, but I'll be done in a second, is this question about the invalid votes. There were 300,000 invalid votes. At the first time they did this, the 4 years ago, there were only about 120,000 invalid votes. And so the big question then becomes, how can you get so many invalid votes? And how does it relate to the process I've just described? Well, in the first place, where you had the woman reading out the votes, and it was an otherwise very orderly process, at one point she read out a vote and said, it goes to X person. I can't remember who it went to, but it went to, let's say the Shui-bian, and then she back and said, no, it's not. It's invalid. And so she takes back the vote, and she shows it to everybody, and we saw the vote, but we found out why she decided it had to be invalid. Because the circle was not put squarely in the box, in that space where the circle was supposed to be drawn. Instead, the circle was drawn below the line and next to the picture of the candidate that person wanted to vote for. But because it was not in that box, it was declared to be invalid. I bring this up because apparently, coinciding with this election was an effort by the two parties to become more rigorous about what actually should be considered a valid vote. In other words, a valid ballot here. And so this was also very interesting because, so that explains sort of part of why there are so many invalid votes. But the other part that's very interesting, and I'll stop with this comment, is that there also apparently while this was all going on, there was a movement, there was a campaign to have people go to the polling places and actually purposely invalidate their ballot. There was apparently something called, and Tom can correct me, it's called the Spoiled Ballot Alliance. Oh, that's right, you were gone there that day. In any case, this was given to me, this information was given by a number of people, and people were talking about this. There was a certain individual who actually organized this campaign. So that would explain why you'd have so many other invalid ballots, other than just something fishy going on. And it also turns out that, according to this one source, that a lot of people who actually participated in this, and essentially as a protest vote, would have been pan-blue supporters. So. In that sense, you might sort of have the Ralph Nader effect, having playing a role in the outcomes of this election as well. And with that, stop.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Now, we do have some time limitations, so I'm going to ask the other two speakers to be as concise and succinct as possible. Spare us
humiliation by the chair.
Spare us my frustrations. So, it's all yours.
Thank you. I know Ramon is a cruel taskmaster, so there are still some seats, and I can't believe how many people come.
Well,
Aren't there some seats? I'm using my time. What do I say? I'd like to thank Jean for inviting me to participate on this panel. In previous elections, I have traveled with both Ramon and Larry. And sorry guys, but it was really probably more fun traveling with Jean.
Having traveled with Jean, I know that.
We won't go into the details of that, but certainly one of the things is that, as Jean said, she had not been back to Taiwan in a long time. And, so it was really fun to have seen the reaction of someone, both to the physical changes as well as the social and political changes. So periodically we had to tell Jean, you're going to suppose your mouth is wide open, you're going to catch flies. So that's because so it was fun hearing that kind of feedback, which those of us who go more frequently or often don't appreciate. Now, I've been working for a long time, and don't ask me when it's going to be finished, for a book that I'm calling Remaking Taiwan, Society in the States Since the End of Martial Law. And one of the types of data that I've been relying on is my participation in delegations observing Taiwan's elections. I think this was the 7th election that I've observed as a member of one delegation or another, invited since 1989. And it's interesting, people say, oh, are you monitoring the elections? Are you supposed to certify that these were fair elections? I say, no. It's called guanchao. It's observe. And what they've done is invite social scientists, they invite democracy activists. They invite influential people, political politicians, and so on to observe these elections, just as a way of seeing the way that Taiwan has changed, and the way that Taiwan is using elections as one of the main mechanisms for remaking the political system. That this is both a reflection of and a mechanism of the remaking of the political system. Now, one area that Larry and I have been part of numerous panels discussing is the question of the degree of consolidation of Taiwan's democracy, whether or not you can measure a degree of consolidation or not. And I remember on a panel after the legislative yuan elections in 2001, where I was more optimistic about the degree of consolidation of Taiwan's democracy than Larry was. Larry was more hesitant to say how far along Taiwan's democracy was in terms of consolidation. And certainly this election does raise questions about how consolidated Taiwan's democracy is. And so one of the questions that we all have to look at for evidence to answer this question is, will the institutions that have been established or reformed over the course of Taiwan's democratic transition since the end of March 1987 in particular, be able to absorb, be able to manage the challenges that have been put up? And so far we have seen that there have been a number of challenges both within the system and outside the system to these institutions. And interestingly enough, of course, one of the main challenges to the institutions is coming from the people who set up these institutions in the first place and are now questioning their legality and their validity. So far, the institutions appear to be holding that there's enough flexibility built into the system that as they stand, they're able to absorb these challenges. So there certainly is a great deal of change that is still underway and that will continue to play itself out. But so far it seems that the institutions will be able to absorb and sort out the challenges to this as they've risen up as a part of this election. Now, I don't want to rehash a lot of the things that Jean said. I just want to make a few additional points. One is, she and I and another colleague from Brigham Young University on Saturday night after the votes were announced, first we're glued to our television sets, and we kept saying we ought to go, let's go out and see what's going on, but nobody could stop watching television because Van John was speaking and Song Chu was speaking. So finally we tore ourselves away and first went to the KMT presidential campaign headquarters. It was very interesting. Most of the crowd, we have this image of what a KMT member or a KMT activist is going to be, but most of the crowd was young and speaking Taiwanese. They were not speaking Mandarin. The people who were on the podium, who were addressing the crowd, screaming at the crowd is what they were doing, were also speaking a mixture of Taiwanese and Mandarin. And I would say more Taiwanese than Mandarin. Now on Sunday, I went to the Zongtong, the presidential palace, presidential office building, the square there where there were, I don't know, tens of thousands of people. I'm not good at crowd estimation, but there's a couple, I'd say well more than 10,000 people gathered. There, it was a much more identifiably mainlander crowd. This may have some questions. I mean, what do we mean by that? But they were speaking Mandarin and they just looked more like a mainlander crowd. If you've been going to Taiwan for 35 years, you would have feel what's a mainlander crowd. So it was a different group of people. Now, maybe it's because it was daytime, maybe it's because it was a Sunday, as opposed to the people who go out at 11 o'clock on Saturday night, other than foreign social scientists, to watch this thing. But also what's interesting is the KMT, the speakers kept talking about we have to be liqing, we have to be rational. On the one hand they say liqing, on the other hand they're saying let's charge the barricades, let's go out on the streets, let's attack the DPP. It was hypocrisy of the greatest order. In addition, one phrase especially someone from Berkeley can appreciate, they kept saying the whole world is watching. And of course they were, anytime someone from the media would come by, they would make sure that the whole world was, they would perform for the media. The tone that they used was being hurt, wounded, somewhat whiny. They were portraying them. They were complaining about being portrayed as rich, corrupt, pro-reunification, not Taiwan firsters, out of touch with Taiwan society. The whole thing was just quite ironic that here you had the KMT out on the streets, storming the barricades, setting up barricades, and then storming the barricades. Whereas the DPP rally, by contrast, was where we went after that, because the KMT rally was really not going anywhere, was going to the metaphorically going to the DPP rally, and people were extremely calm, very quiet, that we were on the cab going over, we were trying, or coming back, we were trying to discuss what was the best adjective to describe the chifa, you know, the mood of the DPP rally, and the best thing we came up with was kumbaya. People sitting, you know, they were singing these sort of kumbaya songs. There was like a love that is swaying back and forth. And then Chen Shui-bian came out on the podium. Remember, this is 24 hours after the assassination attempt. He came out and he was very presidential, unlike Lian and Sung, who were whiny and sort of complaining about it being unfair. 不公正, 不公平, Lian kept saying. Here you have Chen Shui-bian, who was magnanimous, who was presidential, who was calm. We had all the right bases talking about we need to deal with the mainland, we need to deal with the US, we need to deal with the international community. His self-presentation was extremely a great contrast to that of the blue team of Lian and Song. One of the things that, of course, is so, I think, frightening now is that, according to the email traffic that Jean and I both have to sort through every day, I think it was yesterday that Song urged that the blue supporters storm the presidential palace. Was it Jinru Zongtongfu? But apparently now he's changed the Chinese term. I haven't been able to log on in several hours, but he's backed off from the idea of Jinru, which is storming. No, it was Chongjin. Chongjin was storming. Maybe it was Jinru as they backed this softer.
Chongjin.
Yeah, Chongjin, which really implies an attack on the presidential palace. So this was very frightening when you get James Song, and I'm sorry to say he carries a Berkeley degree. But not he learned it all. Maybe it's elsewhere. So I think that in the short term we're going to continue to see a test for Taiwan's institutions. Certainly, the legislative yuan election in the end of the year is going to be an important test of whether Bian really does have a mandate. Certainly, the fact that his vote count went up from 39% in 2000 to something on the order of at least 50% of the votes this time indicates that there is a groundswell of popular support. More people voting for the green side than did in the year 2000. So we've got that, and also just on the Beijing reaction issue. Of course, we have to watch how we have to listen to Beijing's words and watch Beijing's deeds over the course of the next several months. And whereas Beijing has exercised remarkable restraint vis-a-vis Taiwan, I think the more scary issue is what they're doing in Hong Kong. And I think that Hong Kong is the what's the word I want to use? Not scapegoat, but Hong Kong is taking a lot of the heat for what is going on in Taiwan, and that I think is very scary. Hong Kong, the LegCo election is before the DeFi yuan election in Taiwan, so I think these are all issues that will keep us quite occupied for the rest of the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gold. And I turn to my good colleague, Larry. 10 to 15 minutes. If they stole 15 minutes from me and I couldn't stop them.
Your good colleague who will now publicly confess that you were right and I was wrong.
You hear that? Don't forget.
It's a rare event, and you will not hear it happen again, Ramon, so please enjoy it. When I said that Chen Shui-bian, the newly elected president, was a moderate man who was going to reach accommodation with Beijing and rein in some of the impulses of more militant forces in his camp and seek a pragmatic accommodation on the basis of some mutual understanding that would in some way entrench and extend the status quo. And instead, I think I basically agree with Ramon, I'm sorry to say, that I think Chen, and because I wish it weren't true, because in many ways I admire the DPP and Chen himself, this is a party that struggled for democracy in Taiwan. This is a party and a president that even in the last 4 years, I think, has made historic gains in trying to crack down on vote buying, on mafia elements in the country, on many dimensions of undemocratic practices and behaviors. The word democratic in the Democratic Progressive Party has always had a very important and profound meaning in Taiwan's history. But I think that's been called into question in some ways by the tone of the campaign, possibly by some of the developments. And whether or not that's true, I think it's now undeniable that Chen Shui-bian is bent on a campaign to separate Taiwan in a permanent way from the mainland. campaign of creeping independence, which I think is profoundly dangerous, both to Taiwan and to the United States, to the whole region, and which I am convinced, if not stopped, is going to drag the United States into a war with China in the coming 10 years. But let me leave that happy prospect aside for the time being and speak just a few words of analysis about the campaign. First of all, this was perhaps inevitably, given the reduction very rapidly to a two-camp, two-party or two-coalition race, a much more polarized effort than what had gone before in previous presidential election campaigns. And in the language of political party or election analysis, I think we can use the word polarized pluralism. Polarized pluralism exists when you have two camps or two ends of a political spectrum, but you have principal political parties who are a little bit closer to the center and extremist flanks who are then driving them out. And here I think we have to appreciate the role, particularly on the pan-green flank, of Li Dengwei, who ironically has moved to the left of Chen Shui-bian, if you can believe it, on the Taiwan independence issue, and the Taiwan Solidarity Union, and more militant forces within the DPP, who I think have dragged Chen Shui-bian and the center of the DPP away from whatever accommodationist instincts they might have had toward a harder line. And it may be that this was not quite blatantly visible in the campaign, but I think it was an important subtext. And my colleague Chu Yun Han, in a very perceptive analysis that he has written about the campaign, has noted, I think, a very important and subtle trend which should not be missed in terms of the evolution of political debate and dialogue in Taiwan about the question of how the Republic of China on Taiwan relates to the mainland. And that is that the debate in recent years, and certainly the debate in the campaign, has shifted. And I have even seen this in the short time that I have been visiting and studying Taiwan over the last 8 years, has shifted from a debate between reunification versus a pragmatic maintenance of the status quo to a debate between a pragmatic maintenance of the status quo and independence, creeping or not. So the whole spectrum has shifted one large increment over toward the issue of independence. And this has further, I'd say, deepened the intense polarization on the political party spectrum, which we see in elections, in the campaign, in which we're going to see ferociously anew in the Li Fa-Yuen, and certainly revisited inevitably in the campaign for the parliamentary elections at the end of this year. And it has very interesting and I think worrisome implications for cross-strait relations, which I'll return to briefly in mention. The second point I'd want to make is simply an empirical one, and I think it's indisputable if you look at the survey data, which could not legally be published in the final, 10 days of the campaign, but which is coming out now and which shows, I think, quite clearly that if there had not been the attempted assassination on Chen Shui-bian and his running mate, that they would have lost and lost decisively. The tracking polls that were done showed a widening lead for Lian Chan that had widened, in fact, to something like 10 points by March 18th, around 55 to 45, and that simply collapsed to a dead heat on March 19th. And then it was up for grabs. Now, I do not question the legitimacy, the factuality of the reality of the assassination attempt on Chen Shui-bian. But I will simply say that the conviction, and it is a deep conviction on the part of many people in the opposition, that this assassination attempt was staged, that the timing of it and the impact of it were simply too extraordinary to have happened by chance, and that in fact for this reason the election was stolen by a staged event. The belief that this was the case, I think, represents a profound and alarming wound in the Taiwan body politic, and another indication of the point that Tom was making, which I feel much more strongly now than I did 3 or 4 years ago, that Taiwan democracy is not only not consolidated, but that in fact it has moved backwards away from consolidation. And another aspect, and this is why, by the way, I think there absolutely has to be, for the health of Taiwan democracy, a full and rigorously independent investigation of this assassination attempt. The third point I want to make, by way of elaborating what I said, that Taiwan has moved backwards from its halting progress toward democratic consolidation, is the poisonous legacy of bitterness and illegitimacy over the outcome of this. The United States, you know, a democracy for 200 years with many bruises and strains, can, you know, suffer the blow of the belief that a presidential election, namely that of just the year 2000, was stolen, and we get over it and we go on. You know, we've had 50 other presidential elections in our history, or more actually, and we move on and know that 4 years later there'll be another chance to reverse that outcome. Taiwan is a very young democracy that was in 2004 holding only its 3rd direct presidential election, and one in which many people in Taiwan felt that everything was at stake. It was a do-or-die struggle. Pan Blue felt it was fighting for its political life. Pan Green felt they had finally gotten political power, but not been allowed by the obstruction of Pan Blue in the legislature to accomplish very much. Each side felt that it really had to win this election. And now what worries me is that the mutual confidence and trust between competing political actors, that each will play by the rules of the game, that each will respect the rule of law, I think has really been profoundly undermined, if not utterly shredded, in this campaign. And this is why I think there needs to be, I say again, a full and rigorously independent investigation of the assassination attempt. This is why I think there needs to be a close inspection of the 330,000 invalid ballots, and indeed a full and independent recount of the vote, and why each side needs to back down, particularly, as Tom was saying, Pan Blue, from its hyperbolic rhetoric, and reaffirm its commitment to democracy as a political process. It is ironic, and here again I quote my colleague Chu Yun Han, that in the year 2000, Chen Shui-bian won 39.6% of the vote, and no one questioned the legitimacy of his victory, and now he's won just short of 50% of the vote, and about 49% if you include the invalid votes. And most or many of the people who voted for the opposition believe deeply that his election is in fact illegitimate. And when you have a significant segment of the body politic walking around feeling that the outcome of a presidential election is seriously illegitimate, you have a serious crisis for a young democracy. Now let me note in conclusion 4 problems on the horizon in terms of Taiwan's democratic future. One is that we still are left with a deadlocked legislature in which the reaffirmed in this election ruling party, the DPP, does not have a majority. It is hard to imagine that Pan Blue is any more likely to cooperate, particularly if it's not offered some power sharing arrangement, than it was over the last 4 years. So I think we can look forward to continued and in some ways inflamed stalemate, at least until this question is addressed anew in the legislative elections at the end of this year. Second are the whole set of governing difficulties that are going to arise from external or exogenous circumstances of 2 kinds. One is the state of the economy, which is not terribly healthy, although it has recovered somewhat, and the prospect that this election crisis that we will see renewed, deepened capital flight and brain drain, and the struggle over the new constitution and the struggle over cross-strait relations. So let me now conclude with those two issues, cross-strait relations and the struggle over the new constitution. The PRC made a tactical decision that was unusual for it. It must have been very difficult given its tendency toward heavy-handedness and lack of respect for democracy, to basically keep hands off this election, not intervene in the blunt way it did in 1996 and 2000, and hope that by staying silent, maybe they would avoid helping pan-green forces as they did in the previous two elections. I am sure that Beijing is deeply frustrated now that they took the advice of many people in the United States and many moderates among their own analytic circles, and they've gotten 4 more years, as you say, of Chen Shui-bian, and what is inevitably, I think, going to be a resumed creeping campaign toward independence. I think they're going to turn up the heat on Taiwan before too long, and the situation is going to become increasingly tense in the coming years, particularly if Chen proceeds with an effort in incremental slices, always looking very reasonable and just making modest changes in the current situation to extend out the parameters of Taiwan independence and undermine the structure of the status quo. And I tell you really from deep conviction that if this continues unchecked, we are going to have a violent calamity in this region at some point in the next decade. And anyone on this island who thinks that Beijing is not going to use force to stop a slide toward independence simply in order to hold on to a unboycotted Olympics in 2008, I think is living in a dream world. And I say this as someone who's profoundly in sympathy with the people of Taiwan and not the authoritarian regime in Beijing, but sympathy is not enough. We also have to pay attention to geopolitical realities. And having watched innocent American soldiers slaughtered in Iraq in the last week, I am not eager to see them slaughtered needlessly in the Taiwan Strait in the coming decade because of the recklessness of this current government. Finally, I would like to note a new dimension of recklessness that has arisen in the last year or two, to my amazement, being a close reader of the current Taiwan Constitution, which says unambiguously, by means of an agreement that the DPP itself agreed to when the Constitution was last amended a few years ago, that the Constitution can now only be changed by a 3/4 vote of the Li Fa Yuan, and then the approval of an elected National Assembly. Despite this, Chen Shui-bian, who I thought was a Democrat and deeply committed to due process and the rule of law, seems intent on plunging forward with a referendum to change the Constitution by fiat with something less than that very high threshold. And it defies logic for me as a political scientist and student of democracy to imagine how a complete substitution of a constitution with a new constitution can be allowed to obtain a lower threshold of popular approval than a simple amendment of an existing constitution. I want to say flatly, as my final words, that if an attempt is made to replace this constitution with a new constitution by means other than the very high threshold that is established in this Constitution for its amendment, it will be a profoundly undemocratic act, which I think will throw the future of democracy in Taiwan deeply into doubt.
For those forceful, compelling words, Chen Shui-bian is famous for speaking in one way to the outside world and in another way to his own people. When he was interviewed by the Washington Post in the president's office, he said these words. This is the official translation. The reason why we won this election is because we have chosen to stand with the mainstream values of the people, and we have chosen to stand on the right side of history. And I think this election is a choice between love and hatred. On February 28th, the hand-in-hand rally demonstrated that our love for this land and also for other people. The February 28th hand-in-hand rally aimed to unite Taiwan and the people of Taiwan. Quite the contrary. On March 13th rally, staged by the Pan Blue Alliance, was a rally of hatred aimed at dividing Taiwan and dividing the people of Taiwan. They have created conflict and generated much anger, and that's why at this election they have become the minority. I think this trend and phenomenon should be taken very seriously and is worth observing. Anyway, I say that because as a recently elected president to a very divided society, and particularly in which one of the segments of this society is bitter, feeling that the election was cheated from them, that talking this way of love and hatred is not the way to mend the wounds of this society, nor is it a way to consolidate democracy like this president repeatedly tells the world and also tells his people. So I have to say that our colleagues here, I think, gave us different dimensions to look at in this election. We've tried to put this into the broader context of how serious this outcome is for peace and stability, but not only that, for the democracy of Taiwan that so many labored over the last 60 years to promote. And there was suffering and hardship and struggle for all of those people involved in Taiwan's democratic development. The floor is now open, and let's be very brief, and I implore my comrades here to be very, very succinct in replying. Mr. Yu.
Thank you very much, distinguished President Scholar and distinguished audience. I am an American, and I was an observer during the presidential election in March. From listening to your nice and very interesting talk, I feel there are two sides. Two left scholars are more in one thinking, two right scholars are more in different thinking. That's my first observation. Anyway, back to my question. I have two observations and two or three comments.
Be very brief, though.
Yeah, and quickly, the Mark Zedong circle, they use a tool just push it, just like red ink.
Right.
Just push it. Inside has like a people, the style. And number two, the alliance called the Purple Alliance really campaign for invalid vote. Those people just happen to be two key persons. One was the ex-BBP member. One is ex-KMT member. So I don't see any reason for any purpose to try to work whose advantage or disadvantage. I believe both of them hate politics. That's why they campaign for invalid votes. The question number one, you both visit the KMT headquarters. Did you have a chance to visit the BBP headquarters? And what was the comparison between the two? Okay. Second question, the invalid vote, do you know what criteria they put on so that whatever vote becomes invalid? Do you know exactly what the criteria?
Whether it was in the box?
Yeah, so I did see the very, very, very tricky. Anything slightly, if you touch any line, the ballot becomes the invalid. So it's not a matter of where to boom. That's very, very, very tricky. This is a rumor I heard. Also, Mr. Chai Jen-Yan said that after the fact. He said the voters vote for BBB are mostly lower level, lower education. So therefore, they set a very strict rule so that lower level, lower educated people chances are greater to make mistake. That's why I heard that. And one question, last one, I'd like to ask Dr. Ramon. From what I understand in Taiwan, both camps are more a same principle, one side, one country. Shui-bian means one side, one country is the PRC and the Taiwan. and Lianzhan is the PRC and the ROC. Therefore, from the mainstream concept point of view, both camps are quote-unquote emphasizing the mainstream thought. I don't see any camp who had the idea to be emphasized in the unification. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to get a majority vote. But I feel two camps are very close because two camps are more or less in the same political concept, only different way of the economic issues and how you take care of the people in Taiwan. That's my opinion. Thank you very much.
Can we accumulate these
Yes,
questions
that's better.
and have a few more? Okay, Bill, your question.
One quick comment, and that is that in my almost 40 years of living in and visiting and studying Taiwan, I have heard every move by Taiwanese or mainlanders for democracy resulting in people saying the Chinese will get you if you do that. 40 years, the Chinese have not used force, and my guess is that the Chinese governments, the Chinese people on both sides, Taiwan people, Chinese people, both governments have a lot more sense than to do the kind of thing than our United States current government is doing.
We sure hope you're right.
I've been right for 40 years. But my other point is, and I think this is really important, and that is that we're not looking at quite enough of the history here, apart from that 40 years. How many people are actually directly employed by the Kuomintang companies and other institutions? It's a huge number. I don't know. I hope somebody who studies them carefully does know that.
It's much lower than 5 years ago. They've sold off a lot of their assets.
Of course it is. But
They're going to be broke soon if this trend.
as soon as they give it back to the country, then there will begin to be the point of balance among parties where Taiwan can have a truly democratic competition between parties. A party that owns a quarter of the country is not a fair opponent.
Ed, question in the front row.
Just to maybe into sentence. So if China and Taiwan are going to war, as you're concerned, so what is US going to do? That's one. Or,
We hope it won't come to
right,
that.
or is there anything
Ambiguity will prevail.
Right, or is there anything or something that we can do to prevent such a war at this time?
Okay, quick question.
Yeah, two quickies. I just have two quick comments. One is, I respect this person's opinions and oratorical skills, but
Professor Vincent.
okay, yeah, thank you. I'm not good with names, but I didn't really agree with the tone of putting the blame on the EPP if they move to independence, because they're entitled to independence. And if there is a war, it's not his fault. It's not the fault of the EPP. It's the fault of mainland China. And they are the ones who should be condemned, and it's the Chinese people there who should be condemned, because if there is a sustainable war, it's because of the mainland Chinese sustaining it. And the second thing is that, having said that, I don't think that Taiwan will go for independence because I think probably about half to 33% of Taiwan's GDP is dependent on trade with mainland China. And they have invested more than $100 billion into more than 50,000 businesses in mainland China. And this is something they did voluntarily. They'll enforce them and they like the profits. So that's my point.
We hope you're right. Any questions? Well, no questions, then I'm going to give the, all right, quick one, lady in the middle.
It's just a really quick comment, is that contrary to popular belief, I feel that the PRC is probably not frustrated at the result, but instead maybe actually felt quite fortunate. Because I believe that the PRC, what they're really concerned was about the referendum vote, and since less than 50% of the entire voting population in Taiwan actually went and got the ballot, the referendum was invalid. And so for the PRC, that was kind of a burden that they had dropped. And as a matter of fact, with Chen Shui-bian being the president again in Taiwan, the economy situation in Taiwan will probably keep on going downhill, and that will most likely create Taiwan closer to China in a way. And so, which means that if Lian Zhan and Song Shui actually became the president, they may improve the economy of Taiwan, making the people in Taiwan feel like they could become independent. So I feel like this is probably an option from that
Interesting point of view. All right, quickly, we'll have our panelists here give some comments.
Okay, yeah, we visited DPP headquarters and KMT, presidential headquarters at both camps. That's what I said, campaign groups. The DPP headquarters, when we were with some other groups put together, Shui-bian had been meeting most of the groups, but she had to go to Li Yuan to vote on this failed motion to reduce the size of the legislature. So she couldn't brief us. It was a second string person. She just became as fabulous. So this person was not as good. Mike Fonte, who's this American advisor to the DPP, has supplemented, based in Washington. He supplemented what she had to say. The KMT headquarters, the briefing was by Xiaoyiming, who many of you know, PhD, another PhD from Chicago, former head of the GIO and of the Institute of International Relations. And he gave a similar line which Nan John gave in a briefing that Larry and I think Larry was there in 2001, which was to have the gall to argue that the KMT had completely reformed itself. And the KMT, you see, this is Lin John's exact words, sitting with a room of septuagenarians to the far community. The KMT you see before you was a completely new KMT. It's not. The KMT is not reformed until they get rid of certain people at the top. And it's not an age issue. It's just a new thinking, more electable people. Then it's the KMT is never going to be able to win again. Let me also respond to something that Larry said. You know, again, your oratorical skills were phenomenal, and your criticism of Ben, and I think he deserves a lot of it. But I think there's not a question of either or. I think Sung's rhetoric and Nan's rhetoric has been completely irresponsible. I'm worried that Sung is trying to provoke a Haiti or a Georgia type reaction where the U.S. either sends in helicopters to take Vian out, or sits by. I'm serious.
Don't worry, that's not going to happen.
Or sits by and encourages, you know, through possibly Doug Paul or somebody, basically encouraging that this continues to go on, and that the masses rise up and Vian is forced to sneak out the back door. That scares me quite a bit. On the invalid ballot standards, my understanding is that the Pan Blue in the legislative yuan pushed for reforms to make it more stringent.
Precisely.
So that's the point about less educated, you wouldn't know where to put your shop.
Well, it's more than that. It's the reason they did this is because when you buy votes, the way that the person that's buying the vote knows if you've actually done it or not is by you put your vote at a certain place, and there's an agreement. This is sort of why it has to be unified in the center.
And just on the independence, the DPP's line is we're already independent. Why do we have to declare independence? And also the KMT, if you look at the KMT's platform, it's full of Taiwan first. And it's also, the KMT is extremely reactive. They have no new ideas. It's forward to yesterday. We did it in the past, trust us to do it again. We've got the same people, we did it once 50 years ago, we can do it again. and it's you know, it's very much, their argument is also very much, they've no longer said, they complain about being painted as pro-reunification. That's an oversimplification. So when you read their documents and say, we do not leave out independence or reunification as a possible outcome of relations across the strait. So the initiative is completely in the green hand, or I mean, as Ramon said, with Li Donghui as the godfather, I think pushing it.
Well, I actually would have to disagree with Tom on this last
Could
point.
I ask you to chair this meeting?
Okay, fine.
Now we can
Farewell.
He's got to leave.
Where's your helicopter?
All right, I just wanted to make a comment about this KMT, because as somebody that hasn't been to Taiwan in a long time, and I first went to Taiwan when there was still martial law, and I was called in by the authorities because somebody had unknowingly sent me a CIA atlas of China, and I was called in, and my landlady got very upset and wanted to know why I was, receiving Gongfei materials. So coming back now, I have to say that I don't think this is your father's old KMT. To me, it seemed like actually it was a rather different party. Obviously, there still are a lot of the old guard there, but in terms of sort of the old KMT, this very staunch anti-communist line. I think it's ironic they're now painted in this box of being sort of very pro-communist. You know, and I think that one of the things that was very interesting, this has to do with both sort of the money that Hill was talking about. The KMT was complaining this time that one of the reasons why they're not as successful in terms of campaigning is that they're broke now, that they've had to sell off so many of their assets. But the whole point is that they were also, I think, they really failed in sort of capturing the agenda, and they totally let the DPP define what the issues were for this election. Because, you know, they had all of these comments about how poorly the economy was doing, about, you know, spending in health and education, but that was not talked about at all. It was all about, the relations, the cross-strait relations. And I think that, I mean, the impression that I got, again, you know, you've been studying this a lot longer, but, and I think this gentleman was correct. I think there is not anyone now who is willing to accept the one China policy. They've left it very vague. It's one country on either side. It's a question of what do you call it? And the difference that I see is sort of the KMT, they're just being incredibly pragmatic. Their whole line, the thing that really stood out for me was they're saying, well, we cannot resolve this now. We're just not going to resolve it. And we're going to leave this to future generations. And in the meantime, they're being pragmatic and saying, let's focus on the economy. And on the economy and cultural exchanges, and then over time, you know, if it works, it's fine. But we're just not going to deal with it. Whereas clearly, I think what the DPP is doing, and I think Larry is correct here, is they're just trying to move this line that's drawn in the sand.
Step by step.
And step by step, and it's very slyly, and using sort of play on words. And they're saying, well, we don't have to declare independence because we're already independent. You know, that we did this back in back when. And so it's a question of, it is very dangerous. I agree with Larry, it's very dangerous. But at the same time, I would have to say that I think China also has so much on its plate right now that is the last thing that they want to do. They may be forced to do it, but you know, they, I think, have and Hu Jintao has got a lot more on his mind. And I think that both sides would prefer not to have this be brought to a head.
Yeah,
So.
of course. Can I ask the person who is leaving the room?
Bill.
This may be a personal question, but do you have a son or a daughter or a niece or a nephew?
I'm sorry?
Do you have a son or a daughter or a niece or a nephew? Are you willing to have them die on a U.S. Navy ship if you're wrong?
Your position seems to me to be from another planet.
Well, I have to tell you
Not
that
all governments are like the Bush government.
many of us would welcome that, but unfortunately, I would not put the Chinese Communist Party in that wishful thinking category that you've just identified. I think this is a party that's fully capable of using force, that has done so brutally in the past, and if Taiwan moves to independence, will use force to stop it. And I think those, if Taiwan declares formal independence, I think China will act militarily. And those on the island and their friends in the United States who think this won't happen, I must tell you personally, I think are living in a dream world. And I am the one who is saying that I don't want war.
Over the years.
Well, and so I'm asking you if you are willing to accept the consequences of a war which the United States will be forced to fight to prevent the People's Republic of China from conquering by force the island of Taiwan if you are wrong. Are you prepared for those consequences?
Can you hear yourself?
Yes, I just heard myself.
I mean, you sound like Dwight Eisenhower.
Well, what are you saying? That if Taiwan declares independence and China uses military force to subdue it, that our reaction should be having, watch this happen. We should just let the PRC forcibly absorb Taiwan? I mean, what is your position?
My position is that you and I should debate this quietly over a cup of coffee and let people talk about the
Yes,
serious
thank you
issues
very
of
much.
Taiwan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me go on with my response to the issues that
Yes.
were raised. I think that those people who believe that this can go on and on, that Taiwan can continue to slice away further and further dimensions of the status quo, and eventually achieve the dream of the DPP, and what is clearly now, to my mind, the dream of Chen Shui-bian, which morally, to my mind, is an entirely legitimate dream. I see no moral reason, and I never have, by the way, why Taiwan shouldn't be independent. But the question is, and always has been in my mind, whether that dream should be achieved so rapidly as to risk a catastrophic war. And I am consumed by this because I have just come from a war zone. And I have seen a lot of innocent people die as a result of it. And I think people I really think people underestimate the danger we're facing. I don't think it's going to happen in the next year or two. Yes, China has a lot on its plate. But you are a China specialist. And I think you know deeply in your heart the force of Chinese nationalism. And I must say, as someone much less acquainted with China than you do, that my strong impression is that the road that Taiwan is headed on now, which has been in a way enhanced by this election, is not going to be traveled down continuously, indefinitely, without alteration, in a peaceful way. At some point, there is going to be a confrontation. Now let me come to your question. The Bush administration, which fully embraced Taiwan militarily and politically as a strategic ally of China, of the United States, against what they saw coming into office as a looming strategic enemy, namely the PRC, and which view they were quite shaken from as a result of September 11th and the realization of what a strategic enemy really looked like in the world. They now, I think, are quite shaken by what has happened in Taiwan in recent months. And I will say that I think they feel deceived by Chen Shui-bian, who made a commitment that there would be no referendum of any kind, and then in a rather clever way, rhetorically, went back on it. And I think that the Bush administration, which began as the closest ally that the government on Taiwan has had in a very long time in Washington, D.C., is now quite worried about the political trends. I know this for a fact. And I think that no matter which political party wins the election in November, we are going to see a new administration that is going to lean, and this I think is what is going to keep a war from happening, a new American administration that's going to lean much more heavily on Taiwan and really try and get it to just accept some version of the status quo and not try and make radical amendments to it in the name and the structure and so on and so forth. Now, if a second Chen Shui-bian administration doesn't accept those American pleadings, what I predict is a deepening crisis in relations between Taiwan and the United States, because I am not the only one who's looking down the road and seeing the prospect of a war with China. In the strategic situation we face in the world, this is not something that can be viewed with a relaxed attitude by any American administration. So we will see, but I think, for example, if the political process produces a new constitution that renames the country the Republic of Taiwan and drops any reference to China, just to pick one very specific scenario, which I think at this point is quite plausible. I think that this will provoke a very, very serious deterioration in relations between Taipei and Washington. Let's see. I'm not at all convinced that the scenario that this young woman spelled out of a better situation under Chen Shui-bian because the economy will deteriorate and the movement toward Taiwan independence will slow as a result. I don't think so. I think that if the economy improves and cross-strait relations warm or the friction diminishes, what will happen is there's so much integration going on now, economically and socially, across the strait, that this integration will propel a kind of de facto evolution of the status quo in a way that will take the political edge off this controversy and, as one of you said, leave it to a future generation. But I think in the absence of that,
Well, Larry, we just interject here.
Yeah.
One of the very fascinating surveys that have been done is, and this was done, I think, by Zhengzhou University, that they interviewed people who have had investments in Taiwan, and they actually, in China from Taiwan, and that doesn't seem to have the sort of the result that we would anticipate, that they would feel better about PRC and be more inclined toward unification. That doesn't show that has any impact at all. But I would have to say, however, we don't know yet enough about what the sample was. How much investment and how many. What.
But you're talking about the impact directly on investors, correct?
No, I'm talking about those people who have economic relations in investments in China, and then they apparently surveyed these people and found that the proclivity toward reunification it's not there. It's not there. So,
What about the proclivity toward independence?
I don't have that one. We weren't given that one. This is something that's
I don't
very
think
interesting